Saturday marked the 156th anniversary of Juneteenth, and yet, for a lot of people, Juneteenth remains an unknown holiday. This fact lends itself to the continued miseducation, whitewashing, and the lies that are taught in America. That's why it speaks so badly to the need of ethnic studies in our schools, so we'll get the real truth of American history and understand the real contributions, not only of African Americans, but all people here in this country. There are numerous stories that are critical to the shaping of our families and our communities that go unheard each and every day. Fortunately, in today's program, we'll have the opportunity to hear from a few of these stories from our honorable guest speakers. This year's theme focuses on the integral role that Black miners had in the gold rush movement here in California. Through the stories you will hear today, we hope you will walk away encouraged to discover your roots and learn your family's history. Telling our stories is critical to the re-education of this country and the path toward racial equality and real racial justice. Furthermore, we hope to walk away with the understanding of the clear connections between this movement and the legacy of slavery, not only here in California, but across this nation, and the case for reparations. If we fail to learn from our history, we're doomed to repeat it.
It's wonderful to represent you here at the Secretary of State's office. When I tell folks that it took 170 years to have an African American as our Secretary of State, and they said, "Aren't you honored?" I said, "Yes, but I always ask the question, why so long?" But we will figure that out in time as we continue to make a difference. I want to welcome you here to the Secretary of State. I'm honored that this is my real first public event in this building, here in the auditorium. And I'm honored that the Black Caucus chose to come to this facility and to have its celebration of Juneteenth. Because so often we have a view of California that is not necessarily a realistic view in terms of what we're doing here and how we survive. You know, I often thought for years as my father came to California for a better life, and he found a better life here from Hope, Arkansas, that was what California was all about. You know, great opportunity, unlimited possibilities, those kinds of things. And that as I began to study the history of California, I learned that there was another story of California, one that was not as pretty and rosy as the one that my parents saw, but surely better than what they saw in Hope, Arkansas. But there were still a lot of things that took place here in California, so when you go to get an opportunity and you understand the challenges that they faced in their life in terms of making a statement or a life here in California, you will get an appreciation for the work that your ancestors have done and why it's been so important. You know, we have in this, the story of California, we think of California as a free state, and yet there are many, many examples that took place here in California where people were brought to California as slaves, were made to stay in California as slaves, and then when it was opportunity for them to remain in California, they wanted to remain. But the governor and others decided that they would pass a fugitive slave law in California. So if you came here, you were sent back to Mississippi, back to Alabama, wherever, in order to be enslaved. We know that the first governor of California constantly talked about how he wanted to basically get rid of all African Americans out of the state of California. And he said this publicly, and they began to work hard to make sure we were limited in our abilities and the opportunities that were there. When we study the history of California, we even look in Los Angeles with all the redlining and the activities that took place, and we think about those families that lost property and never regained that property in our continuing struggle to make it right and just. You know, this journey that we're on, we're going to obviously accent it with AB 3121, which is our reparations bill. And some of you have sent me some amazing materials on the enslavement of African Americans in this country, in California. And you've sent me some amazing information concerning an underground railroad here in California where black people had to live and try to work and have a life of their own in the face of the kind of discrimination that they experienced. So it becomes important that when we talk about reparations that we have a full picture of California and what took place. So we have a tremendous challenge ahead of us in terms of trying to create equal opportunity and justice for all. And that becomes important as we talk about our future in California, our future in this nation. California will be the light in terms of reparations. It will teach this nation how we deal with the issues of abuse, how we should deal with the issues of injustice, how we should make atone for those things, and how we should repair the damage that has been done.
You know, I'm up here because I want to talk about history, just about our history and how in my family we had a lot of griots, a lot of people who were storytellers. They would pass down stories generation and generation. Not only would they tell me about slavery and lynching and Jim Crow laws and things of that nature, but if it wasn't for those griots in our family, we probably would know about Bruce's Beach and the work that Mr. Bradford did in restoring that property to an African-American family that was stolen from them decades before. That's why this is so important to learn your history. When I was growing up as a relative, a member of the Little Rock Nine, I used to hear these stories over and over and over again. And if any of you being young, when you're teenagers, after a while, you wanted to say, you know, I've heard this story over and over again. I don't want to hear it anymore. Now I'm the grill. Now I'm the one that has to repeat those stories. Now I understand why. Because if we don't repeat them, then people won't know what they need not to do in the future. And when you think of critical race theory, it is not to shame white people. It is not to make them feel inferior. It's to ensure that we never repeat the mistakes that we made before. Critical race theory that's the essence of it. It's not all this other stuff that these other people are talking about. Because at the end of the day, every day I learned something from those 9 kids that integrated Little Rock Central High School in 1957. Juneteenth is just one example of why we need to repeat letting people know. People in Texas were denied the opportunity to be free for 2 years. Juneteenth lets you know that America could delay justice for anybody. Let me say that again. Juneteenth will remind you that justice can be delayed for any of us. That's why we need to continue to talk about it so we never, ever, ever have to repeat that again. And so, on behalf of the Legislative Black Caucus, on behalf of my family, take advantage of doing your family research. Take advantage of finding out who you really are. Because I will tell you, when you find out the struggle of the people from whence you came from, who got off of those slave ships from Africa, who worked those plantations, that got you here to work in the state, they did a lot to make sure you're alive and well and flourishing to be here today. And so that when you think about how you're going to move forward and what you need to do, you need to think about, be that grill to tell those stories to the next generation that are here today. Because there are a lot of people that want to erase that history, want to whitewash that history forever. And we can't let that happen. And so that's why we're here today, to remember everything and to continue to move on and to continue to succeed in every field of human endeavor.
You know, we celebrated Juneteenth on the Senate floor last week, Freedom Day, and I mentioned how so few people actually know about Juneteenth, even many African Americans. It is a shame that we are not talking about this in our schools, from our K through 12 to our secondary schools and beyond. And as I shared on the floor, the only reason I think why I knew a little bit about Juneteenth was because I had the fortune of being held when I first was born by my great-great-great-grandmother, Graham, who was actually born a slave and had her freedom papers and her Republican voter registration card to prove it. And the running joke in the family was she always voted Republican, even in the 60s, and my mother had to tell her, well, you know, the party is a lot different now with Nixon, but she said that was the party that freed me. And it is really important, as Assemblymember Jones-Sawyer mentioned, for us to know our history, for us to know who we are. You know, the California Legislative Black Caucus has a very robust legislative priority list, We do a lot of work in the criminal justice space, but we are equally focused on emancipation, on freedom in other aspects of policy. So when we were talking about and celebrating Bruce Speech, when we're talking about housing, when we're talking about being on corporate boards and diversifying that, when we are talking about the Upward Mobility Act, when we are talking about supporting black businesses, all of those are policies around emancipation and on freeing black people from these systems that are designed to keep us subservient. So don't get it twisted and don't be afraid when you start hearing us talking about economic justice and economic equity and rebuilding generational wealth. Black folks were involved in the gold rush. Black folks were foresters and involved in the lumber business and economy. Tulsa is an amazing story about black wealth and self-determination and dominion. And it is incredibly important for us to continue to talk about those issues. And we are and we will continue to do so through the policy. CLBC is comprised of a diverse group of incredibly woke and aggressive black individuals who have the future of black Californians in mind. And we will be very aggressive this year under the chairmanship of Senator Steve Bradford.
This is about telling our stories that are critical to the re-education of this country. And we have much, much work to do to make sure that we know who we are and where we came from. Because much of it has been buried, much of it has been whitewashed, most of it has been lied to us. So this is important. To each and every one of you who have joined us here today, especially our non-African American allies, because without you, we could not tell our story. And we need you to go back to your family and your friends and tell that story, a story that needs to be told in order to hopefully enlighten each and every one of you, and you walk away better informed by creating a conversation and encourage you to dig deeper into the history, not only of African Americans, but the history of America, the history of your community, the history of your family. I want to share a little bit of history. You all have red drinks in front of you, and I hope, do anyone know why that drink is red? See, that's part of Juneteenth. There were 3 traditional items that you always had at a Juneteenth event. My family's from Texas. I was born in Texas. My father went back to Texas every year, the last 10 years of his life, to celebrate Juneteenth. He didn't do it for one day. He stayed there for the entire month of June. The red signifies the blood that we shared for this country, as while in bondage and free. It was red hibiscus. It moved and evolved to red soda pop, but we can't find red soda pop no more. It was watermelon. We don't have any greater affinity to watermelon than anybody else, but the watermelon was part of that tradition of representing the blood, and it was red velvet cake. Yeah, black folks came up with red velvet cake. So those 3 things were always in a Juneteenth celebration. I don't know if we got any red velvet cake over there, but we do have red soda water. So there's plenty of it there. There's plenty of food. So again, thank you each and every one of you for joining us here. Continue to mingle and conversation. It's much to be learned and much to be discussed, and that concludes our program. We'll be here to 6:30. Thank you very much.